Hello and welcome to the Underhand Free Throw. I am Simon and today I'm going to be recording something we don't typically do, but this is just going to be a short reaction to the full, entire, complete return for Damian Lillard. As of this morning, October 1st, the Boston Celtics have traded for Jrue Holiday, which was kind of the major piece that Portland got in return from the Milwaukee Bucks, at least in terms of salary and the good player involved in the trade coming back to Portland. So now that we have kind of the full news on what Portland got for their franchise superstar Damian Lillard, I wanted to take a look at it and reflect a little bit on what this means for the Blazers, and then maybe just a touch on the Bucks and the Celtics as well. So here's a complete breakdown of all the assets involved in the trade from the perspective of the Portland Trail Blazers. We sent out Damian Lillard, we sent out Jusuf Nurkic, previously our starting center, Nasir Little and Keon Johnson, both of whom were kind of bit role players. Nasir Little played a little bit more of a role for us, a pretty athletic, exciting young prospect, had 3-and-D upside, but really struggled to stay healthy the past couple of years and play consistent minutes. So the major losses that we're getting in terms of what will actually impact the team's rotation next year are, of course, Dame and Jusuf Nurkic, who was the starting center. Although, as many Portland Trail Blazer fans will admit, probably one of the lowest level starting centers in the NBA. He really struggled to stay on the court. He wasn't particularly effective either defensively or offensively when he was on the court. And he had about 3 years and $55 million left on his contract. I personally would consider that a negative asset, so the sending out to the trading of Jusuf Nurkic is not even necessarily like a downside from a Trailblazers perspective, as long as we replace him with someone. And as it turns out, we did, because as part of the return, the major player centerpiece involved in the return is DeAndre Ayton. So he's a guy that can really stand out on the low light reel at times, although, from my perspective, I would actually consider him a defensive upgrade from Jusuf Nurkic, who struggled with some of the same effort, lapses in effort and consistency issues. And then on top of that, Nurkic is just hurt all the time, and he misses like half of every season, which hasn't been the case with Ayton so far in his career, and Ayton's younger and also a much better athlete. So from the jump, a lot of people aren't necessarily thrilled with what they've seen from Ayton, especially in the playoffs the last couple of years, but I'm pretty excited about adding him to the young core that the Blazers have at the moment, and I think it's absolutely worth a flyer on a guy that's this talented. He's making a lot of money, but this isn't exactly a team that's looking to be a player in free agency right now anyway, so that's totally fine. And then to shore up the big man rotation, we also received Robert Williams. This was a part of the Celtics portion of the trade in which they acquired Jrue Holiday for Robert Williams, Malcolm Brogdon, and a couple of first-round picks. So Robert Williams is a really fantastic defensive center. Weak side rim protection is kind of his specialty, but also he is very mobile, which is why I think he succeeded so much with the Celtics these past couple of years, who were elite defensively at times, given certain lineups. And one of those lineups is when they had Al Horford at the 5, and then Robert Williams. Well, Robert Williams was effectively playing the 5, right? But he wasn't necessarily doing the man-on-man, big-man defense. He was more coming in and closing down the paint on drives. And then the Celtics, having their large athletic wings, would rotate to close out on three-point shooters. And that was a really effective defensive system. So on our team, he's probably going to be more of a true 5. We really don't have a 4-man who can effectively guard big men one-on-one, That's not exactly Jeremy Grant's game, but Robert Williams will probably be the backup center in most cases here with Ayton on the floor. Don't expect to see them paired too much together. Doesn't sound like a great offensive fit, but Robert Williams has had issues staying healthy, so maybe this reduction in role where he's playing less minutes and he's less relied upon, a great way to really recover his career and his value. Also, Robert Williams, only 25 years old, much like DeAndre Ayton, so here's another potential guy with some upside as well, if he can stay healthy. So those are the two young players involved in this trade that we can get excited about as potentially a part of Portland's future. There was also Malcolm Brogdon. He's really more of a salary filler. I don't expect to see him stay with the team long term, as he is on the wrong side of 30 for this young core that we have developing, and he was also pretty discontented being in Boston. And also, this is definitely the high-level role player type of guy that we're definitely going to be looking to move probably by the trade deadline this year and maybe pick up a couple of more assets. I don't expect to get anything crazy in return for Malcolm Brogdon because All reports are that the Celtics tried to trade him for a while, and they weren't really seeing a whole lot until they finally could use him as the salary necessary to facilitate a Drew Holiday trade. Now let's get into the draft picks. So we got a total of 3 first-round picks as well as 2 swaps. And the exciting thing is 2 of these picks are unprotected. That would be the Bucks and the Celtics 2029 first-round picks. Now that is quite a ways in the future. 6 years is a long time to wait. And who knows what the case with those teams is going to be at the time. Like, you can always speculate. The Celtics are still, their key players are still kind of in their mid-20s. It's very possible to have a world in which the Celtics are still a very good team 6 years from now. So maybe that pick doesn't have the highest upside in the world. The Bucks are a little bit older, and the Bucks also have very few draft assets and young players on their current roster. So we'll see how that changes if a nightmare scenario happens and Giannis asks to be traded within the next couple of years. I'm sure that they can flip him for a pretty good core of assets to rebuild around, which may mean by 2029 the Bucks are in good shape. But also, who knows, maybe the Bucks stretch out these next 4 or 5 years contending, and then they get old, and that 2029 pick could be a juicy one. We also have the Warriors pick from this upcoming year. It is only protected top 4, so the pick is highly likely to transfer. Although the Warriors are a good team. They're likely going to be in the playoffs. I don't expect to see this to be a lottery pick. Probably a pick in the 20s is what we're looking at there. Although, I'd always much rather take, a pick in the 20s if you can get it, versus like a second-round pick or like a heavily protected first-round pick that isn't going to convey for years and years and years. At least we're going to get a player out of this, and it's very much up to our draft and development staffing as to whether that player is a good one or not. And then finally, we have swap rights with the Bucks in 2028 and 2030. Again, like I was talking about with their 2029 pick earlier, whether this is an asset or not really just depends on the state of the Bucks franchise in 5 and 7 years from now. And that's so far in the future, and it's just very difficult to predict what the Bucks are going to look like. Although, as I've said before, there's always the case that the Bucks just kind of age out with their current core and they aren't able to really reload. And in that case, we'd probably be interested in swapping those picks and kind of upgrading our first-round picks in those years. So now I just want to talk really briefly about, kind of the projected Blazers rotation this season, what I expect from them, and what this means post all of these trades. So we really have jettisoned a lot of the older veteran players from this roster. Pretty much everyone who's going to be playing significant minutes is, in the early to mid-20s, with probably the one exception of Jeremy Grant, although he is still under 30 years old. So the future of this team as currently constructed are probably going to be the 3 names that come to mind are like Anthony Simons, Shaedon Sharpe, and Scoot Henderson, and all 3 of those guys are guards. You can put all of them on the floor together. That does mean you're going to be a very small backcourt without a lot of ability to defend anyone on the perimeter, to be quite honest. And that means we're going to be really relying on DeAndre Ayton to be a paint presence to have any kind of chance of not being like the worst defense in the NBA. Although the trajectory of this team is very much rebuilding at the moment, so maybe being a terrible defense is not necessarily the worst thing in the world, because that's just going to help out our draft odds. The one other thing I will say, because that 3-guard backcourt, if the goal is just to lose as many games as possible and develop the young guys and get them some run, sure, absolutely go for that. But if not, I could definitely see a world in which those 3 rotate out for the 2 guard spots, and then we try to find another starting quality forward on this team, or just someone who can kind of eat some minutes. The other name that immediately comes to mind is Matisse Thybulle, who has had a role of, starting or playing decent minutes on the Sixers when the Sixers were a good team. He's certainly a very good defender, especially when playing passing lanes and off-ball. He's not really the greatest on-ball stopper in the world. He reminds me a little bit of a former Blazer Robert Covington in that respect, just a guy who is really good at preventing the other team from running their offensive set as smoothly as they would like to, but isn't necessarily a guy that you're going to put on the other team's best isolation scorer to lock him down. Aside from Matisse, who we did extend this offseason and may be around this team in another few years, so maybe we can see them as a potential future piece. But he certainly really struggles on the offensive side of the floor, so you'd like to find another guy as kind of more of a reliable long-term option. We also drafted Chris Murray, the twin brother of Keegan Murray, during this draft. And then we also have Jabari Walker on the team from previous year's draft. So he didn't necessarily play a whole lot, but both of these guys are bigger forwards. Jabari Walker is the more athletic of the two, and Chris Murray is the more offensively skilled of the two. So I could see a role for either of those two guys kind of developing as the season goes on. I'm excited about both of them. I'm just not sure if they're really ready to step into a significant role and play a ton this year. So what does all this mean for the Blazers long term? Am I, as a Blazers fan, happy with the overall return that we got for Damian Lillard? I would say for the most part I am. And we didn't get, a huge, massive chest of draft assets in return. If you kind of think back and think of some of these recent superstar trades, like what the Rockets got in return for James Harden, or what the Thunder got in return for Paul George. A lot of times those, there's many, many draft picks involved, or even what the Jazz got for Rudy Gobert from the Timberwolves a couple years ago, where there's like 4 or 5 first-round draft assets in the trade, whether it's just straight-up first-round picks or including swaps. We didn't quite get that level of draft return, but we did get DeAndre Ayton. So we actually got a young player that has at times been a fairly high-level player. Not sure if Ayton's ever going to quite be all-star caliber, but he's shown flashes of both being really, really elite on the defensive end of the floor. The kind of lapses in effort notwithstanding, but he's one of the few guys in the NBA that's athletic and quick enough as a 7-footer to both switch out and guard the perimeter as well as protect the rim. And that is an incredibly rare physical package. There's hardly any players in the NBA who you can really describe in that way. So that has elite defensive upside if the IQ and the effort continue to grow to match the physical tools. And all I'll say on that one is we'll see. We also have Robert Williams, not quite as exciting or, not as much of a big box office name, I guess, as DeAndre Ayton, although, still young and still a very elite defensive center. I'm really excited about just our ability to prevent games from turning into a layup line, because a lot of times last season, Yusuf Nurkic provided a little bit of resistance when he wanted to, but when he was out of the game especially, Portland really had no backup center last year to speak of. And anytime Yusuf Nurkic was out of the game, it was warm-up session. It was a layup line, especially because, our backcourt was really small and didn't provide a lot of resistance at the point of attack. That's still not going to change that much this season. I guess we'll see how quickly Scoot really takes on to defending at the NBA level. But I don't expect that to change too much this season. But at the very least, we have some backline rim protection this year, which is something we did not have last year at 2 levels. At both of our starting player as well as his backup can really just shut off the water in terms of, not being able to finish uncontested shots around the rim all the time. So that I am looking forward to. And then, I will admit, we didn't get really a lot of help at any other position on the floor because I don't expect Malcolm Brogdon to be long for this team. I guess we'll see what we get in return for him if he is traded this season. And, the draft assets aren't terribly exciting, but I do see this as just a opportunity to let our young guys really play, to be able to be more aggressive on defense and make some mistakes, knowing it's not a guaranteed 2 points if they overcommit a little bit onto a passing lane or trying to blow up a pick and roll. So I kind of see that as a benefit that at least allows them to experiment a bit more defensively, because although Anthony Simons has not been a very good defender so far in his career, Shaedon Sharpe hasn't had much opportunity but hasn't looked great when he has played, and Scoot Henderson is very much an unknown. All 3 of these guys are very athletic and very quick, and it means that you can try things with them. And I especially like the idea of just being at least attempting just to really swarm ball handlers. Really swarm ball handlers, try to hedge, try to use our speed and athleticism advantage to, just muck up the opponent's actions offensively and try to make things not so free and easy for them, knowing that it's not a complete scramble to recover because, Ayton and Williams can do. Because DeAndre Ayton and Robert Williams, while in possession, are going to do a really good job of protecting the rim on the back line. All told, I would say that the trade return that we got looking at all the assets and all the players that we got in return for Damian Lillard, I would say I like the overall return that we got. I like the trade return. I like the trade return pretty well. I would say I would be more excited about it if there was one more player thrown into it, or potentially even one more draft pick thrown into it. But at the same time, while saying that, I also realized it was not easy to trade Damian Lillard, because initially he only had one team that he wanted to go to, and then expanded that list to a total of 3 teams. So we were not exactly working with the majority of the NBA, and also being that he's a smaller, older guard who's making a lot of money, that also kind of reduces the amount of teams that would necessarily want to trade for him in return. So understanding that the market for him was not necessarily unlimited, and we were working with what we were working with, I thought we got a pretty good return. In terms of comparing this trade to some other proposed trades from, like the Heat or the Nets, or, there's a few other trade packages that I saw of, just completely theoretical what the Blazers could get in return for Damian Lillard prior to when he was traded. I think the return that we ended up getting for him, centered around DeAndre Ayton and a couple of picks and Robert Williams, is superior in value to pretty much anything that a lot of people were proposing or theorizing. So overall, I got to give Joe Cronin a thumbs up on this one. I would say fairly good trade, especially because it sounds like he was really only working with like 2 or 3 teams and trying to pit those against each other. And that's harder to get a good return for, and versus when you're just able to negotiate with the entire league. Okay, now let's talk really, really briefly about what this means for the Bucks and the Celtics, because the 2 best teams in the East were both involved in the Damian Lillard trade, and both of them have upgraded their rosters from what they were, at the conclusion of free agency, and what a lot of people expected to see from them going into next season. So the Bucks significantly increased their ability to score in the half court. Damian Lillard, although he is a score-first guard, he's actually a pretty excellent playmaker with pretty good vision as well. He is going to be very much needed for the Bucks, because one thing that they lacked, in addition to just shooting in the half court, a lot of teams could increase their shooting. That's just something that you can infinitely get better at, I feel like. But one thing the Bucks really lacked is they really lacked a playmaking partner with Giannis. And they did have Chris Middleton. That was kind of their best bet. Although Chris Middleton really does not have the speed or the burst to break down a defense as the ball handler in a pick and roll to the same extent that Damian Lillard does. So I think that this trade just instantly increases the Bucks, increases the difficulty that it's going to take for other teams to guard the Bucks in the half court. The one downside is they did lose a bit of depth in this trade. They sent out Grayson Allen, who was a starter for them last year and a significant minutes eater. So they're going to need to find the kind of that 5th guy in the rotation, and it's not immediately obvious who it's going to be looking at their current roster. It might be Pat Connaughton, although he's kind of an imperfect fit alongside Chris Middleton and Damian Lillard in the backcourt for a variety of reasons. Not the most consistent shooter in the world, not necessarily the guy I want chasing around small guards in the defensive end of the floor either. But I will say, a lot of teams are going to have flaws in their rotation, so the Bucks having one is by no means, it's by no means ruining their championship hopes. I've seen a few people speculate like, oh, since the Bucks don't have a perfect 5-man rotation, this means that they're so, they're overhyped, I guess. They're a little bit more vulnerable to getting knocked out in the playoffs than you'd expect. And I'll say, the Bucks are definitely not a perfect team. They're definitely not I wouldn't even necessarily call them championship favorites or Eastern Conference favorites. Maybe co-favorites, I guess, with the Celtics, just in terms of talent. But this should be a very solid team. They should still be decent on the defensive end of the floor. Damian Lillard is not a good defender, but at the same time, putting one bad defender into your starting lineup, it doesn't immediately ruin a team's hopes of being competent defensively. From the Bucks' point of view, I'm a lot more worried about their wing defense, actually, than their ability to guard guards. Considering their major opponent in the East has incredible wing players, and the Bucks were already struggling mightily to guard wings before they traded Drew Holiday. It's kind of one of the major weaknesses of their team, and even though Drew Holiday was undersized, he was by far their best matchup, even against larger wings, and now they really don't have anyone that's all that competent in guarding the Jason Tatums of the world. So from the Bucks' perspective, I'd be more worried about guarding Jason Tatum than I would be about, finding someone to stash on Derek White personally, but that's just more how I look at it. And then from the Celtics' point of view, this is huge. They acquired Drew Holiday. They did give up Robert Williams and Malcolm Brogdon, but neither of those guys were, super meaningful parts of the team in last year's playoffs. Robert Williams theoretically should be, but his injuries and just overall inconsistency have kind of made him a guy that the Celtics can't super rely upon. And then also they have Kristaps Porzingis on the team now, and it's just a little bit more of an awkward fit trying to get Robert Williams on the floor when you're playing Kristaps Porzingis heavy minutes. So them moving Robert Williams, I don't think was, moving the foundation of their team necessarily. And then Malcolm Brogdon, he did get hurt in the playoffs, but he was pretty dreadfully bad, especially as the playoffs proceeded. And he wasn't really a guy that the Celtics were relying on anyway. And then once he caught wind of the Celtics trying to trade him initially in the Kristaps Porzingis trade, he got frustrated and wanted out. So this wasn't a guy that was going to be, part of the Celtics rotation anyway this upcoming season, or at least not, a super positive one. So they kind of traded two guys that weren't necessarily going to be make or break for them this season. And then they got Drew Holiday, who's, I don't know if you necessarily consider him an all-star quality guard. I guess he is. He's made a couple of all-star teams recently. But, definitely one of the best ancillary pieces in the entire NBA. And he really fills out the Celtics, he significantly improves the Celtics' ability to defend the perimeter. And, you don't love Drew Holiday necessarily when he's your guy that you're asking to create offense. The Bucks really struggle with that the past couple of years in the playoffs. But when he's just another of a group of people, and I guess the Celtics are kind of going to attack defenses, run offense by committee, because they don't have necessarily like a primary playmaker, unless that guy is just Jason Tatum and he's going to improve as a playmaker and really step into that role. But they kind of have a bunch of people who are like decent at passing the ball and moving the ball and finding people and are at least willing to do that. And Drew Holiday fits into that system really nicely. So yeah, Drew Holiday didn't necessarily fit the Bucks super well going into this season just because he kind of limited what they could do in the half court because they're asking Drew Holiday to create offense for them. But the Celtics are not going to ask Drew Holiday to do that nearly as much. He's going to be more of an off-ball guy, more of a playmaking by committee sort of offensive system with the Celtics, and Drew Holiday is just going to fit into that beautifully. The Celtics defense should be, pretty much impenetrable for perimeter players next year. They do lose a little bit of rim protection with Robert Williams gone, but at the same time, Kristaps Porzingis is a pretty good rim protector as well, as long as you can avoid having him having to run out and guard in space. But when you have four awesome defenders alongside Kristaps Porzingis, that's a lot less of an issue. He can be a lot more stationary and just worry about protecting the basket, which is what he excels at. So really exciting trade for the Celtics. When the initial trade went down, when Damian Lillard went to the Bucks, I saw a lot of reactions like, oh, Bucks, Eastern Conference favorites. Like they tipped the scales. They got to that level where they're just ahead of the Celtics now. And I was a little bit skeptical of that at the time. And I have to say, now that the Celtics have gotten involved in this and they've reloaded as well, I'm still very much favoring the Celtics this upcoming season as the best team in the Eastern Conference. And maybe Drew Holiday will be that steadying veteran presence that this team has really needed to just kind of calm down the team and prevent a situation happening like Game 4 against the Miami Heat last year, where the Celtics, in the Eastern Conference Finals, where it just appeared that Celtics lost the willingness to play basketball in like a near must-win game and kind of just conceded one to the Heat. So maybe Drew Holiday will help a little bit in that regard, kind of be that veteran leader that this team so desperately needs. And he definitely helps them on the court as well. Okay, that has been my rambling thoughts. As a Blazers fan, I just got to say I'm happy with the return that we got for the trade. Overall, it's not the best return that you can ever expect for a superstar-level player, a guy who has been considered in recent seasons one of the 10 best players in the NBA. But he is aging, he's making a lot of money, and he kind of fits a role that isn't not exactly the type of player that every single team in the NBA would necessarily love to trade for. And it's a little bit ironic that we just went right back around as a Blazers franchise and traded like the best guy in the NBA at stopping Damian Lillard to their biggest rival in the Celtics. So I think it's funny how involved that my team is here in kind of determining the outcome of the Eastern Conference Finals this next season. So hopefully we do see Bucks Celtics. It's kind of what we're very much set up for this upcoming season. I'm excited. I'm still rooting for Dame. I'll still always be a Damian Lillard fan to some extent, but I'm definitely more of a Trailblazers fan than I am a Damian Lillard fan. So I appreciate what he did for us as a franchise, but I'm also really excited for the Scoot Henderson era and moving forward with this young team, which will hopefully be good. Not this year, but in a few years from now. So anyway, that is all for me. Thanks for listening to my rambling, and we'll see you next time on the Underhand Free Throw.